Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our webinar to do with the national minimum wage. Sorry about that. Afternoon, after lunch, I'm already getting a little bit off the mark there. Very timely for us to have this webinar, given the events of the last couple of weeks. We have everyone in mute only at the moment, and if you have any questions, please feel free to put them into the question panel on the right-hand side of your screen. We may or may not get to them during the session, but we will endeavour to answer some questions when we do a follow-up email with the webinar recording. So please send those through. I'll introduce you to our special guest presenter, David Bates. He's the Managing Director of Workforce Guardian, which is ADP's partner. Welcome, David.
Hi, Angela. How are you going?
Thank you. It's great to have you back.
Always a pleasure to be here, working with ADP to try and unpack the complexities of Australia's employment law, and the national minimum wage is no exception.
Exactly, David. So for those of you who usually join us for this webinar series, I generally chime in with some tax stuff, but I think this time we'll be mostly focused on David's more HR and, as you said, you know, the unpacking of it all. I'll leave it all to you this time around.
No worries at all. Yeah, there's not so much, I suppose, in this particular topic that goes into the world of taxation. So, yeah, it makes sense.
Yeah, not so much. So, that said, I'll hand over to you, David, and you can drive us from here.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Angela. So, yeah, please allow me to add my very warm welcome to all of you taking part in the webinar today. As I said, it really is a pleasure for Workforce Guardian to partner with our good friends at ADP to present this information to Australian employers. Now, the national minimum wage is always topical at this time of year, and I'll explain why in just a moment. But by way of background, I think it is just worth noting that there are a lot of myths and misconceptions around there when it comes to Australia's national minimum wage. So during the course of this webinar, we're going to explore some of those. We'll explain how the national minimum wage comes about, and we'll also explain to you for your own employees where you obtain the correct minimum wage for your staff. And as we'll see, it does depend on whether or not the employees in question are covered by a modern award, an enterprise agreement, or if they're not covered by either of those, then the national minimum wage. So we'll work through that step by step, and I'd expect that in about half an hour or so from now, you'll have a much clearer understanding of what this national minimum wage fiasco, as I call it, because it is quite complex. We'll talk about how that all came about, and you'll have a really clear idea about what it means for you and your business. So in summary, what we'll be doing over the next half an hour is I want to start off by talking a little bit about the Fair Work Act itself, because the national minimum wage relates to the national Fair Work system, and not everybody in Australia is covered by the Fair Work laws. Now, Angela, you'd know from the webinars that we've already co-hosted this year on a range of HR topics, we've started off every one of them by just reminding people about the coverage issues, if you like. So we will revisit that for those of you who, particularly who are joining us from Western Australia. We'll then talk about how you do actually go about finding the right rate of pay, and then we'll talk about this national minimum wage order, which is handed down every year by the Fair Work Commission. You're probably aware I'm not the biggest fan of the Fair Work Commission, but nonetheless, they are the ones in charge of making the minimum wage order each year. So we'll explain how that works, and then we'll answer some of the most commonly asked questions, only three, but the most commonly asked questions about the minimum. Hopefully, they're probably the questions that you have in your mind, so you'll have an answer to them today. All right, so let's have a look at this Fair Work coverage just as a starting point. Now, there's a beautiful map of our country. You'd notice that one state is in a different colour, and that's because WA likes to be different. I grew up in Perth, so I can say that. And the situation in WA is that the Fair Work Act, in fact, the National Employment Relations System, which is governed by the Fair Work Act, will only apply to your business if you are an incorporated entity in WA. So if you're in the private sector in any other part of the country, then it's almost guaranteed that you are covered by the Fair Work Act, and that then the national minimum wage is relevant for you. But if you're in WA, and if your business is not an incorporated entity, so you might be a sole trader or an unincorporated partnership, for example, then your business is in fact bound by WA's own state-based industrial relations laws, and it is worthwhile just keeping that in mind. Okay, so different scenario in WA. But for the vast majority of us, including all incorporated entities in WA, we have the Fair Work laws. Part of the Fair Work legislation is the national minimum wage, which we're discussing today. Now, as that little snippet of Western Australia's different scenario might have already suggested, Australia is home to some of the world's most complicated, I would say most hopelessly complicated employment laws, because for all of you out there who are trying to run your business, you've got all of these competing priorities, and probably the last thing you have in mind are the 800 or so pages of the Fair Work Act. But unfortunately, we've got the Fair Work legislation, then we've also got a whole range of what we call industrial instruments. And by industrial instruments, I'm specifically referring to modern awards and enterprise agreements. Now, modern awards are these documents which contain minimum terms and conditions of employment that apply in particular industries and occupations. So, for example, if you are performing clerical job, you might fall under the Clerk's Private Sector Award 2010. Similarly, if you're in manufacturing, you might logically be covered by the Manufacturing and Associated Industries and Occupations Award, very catchy. That award applies to that particular industry as well. So you've got over 130 modern awards, and most people in Australia are covered by one of these awards. They contain minimum rates of pay. We've also got enterprise agreements, which are these documents which are negotiated at a workplace level between employers and their employees, sometimes with union involvement. Enterprise agreements contain their own minimum rates of pay. And then we've got people who are not covered by any of those industrial instruments, so people that we call award and agreement free. Those people are the ones who are captured by the national minimum wage. So three different, if you like, streams to keep in mind: modern award coverage, enterprise agreement coverage, and then people who are award and agreement free.
I'll tell you what, David, it is really frustrating, and obviously dealing with clients that are employers, often they will, say to us, well, where do I go? Where do I look? And the answer is depends.
It really does, right?
And really sometimes I think they think I'm just trying to sort of get out of giving them a straight answer, but
yeah.
it is quite complicated.
That's because giving them a straight answer in Australia is so difficult, right?
Yeah.
I mean, if you were to go to New Zealand or the UK or most other countries in the developed world, finding out how much you have to pay your staff is a relatively straightforward exercise. Sometimes I feel like I should be paid a commission by the New Zealand government, because I'm constantly talking about how the New Zealand labour laws are so much simpler and make so much more sense than Australia's own employment laws, particularly because of these modern awards. And when it comes to the minimum wage, it's the modern awards which really make things complex.
Right.
But be that as it may, it's worth noting that we do have those three streams that we have to keep in mind. And it's also worth noting that this Fair Work Commission, the Independent Industrial Relations Tribunal, each year hands down what it calls the National Minimum Wage Order. And what's fascinating, I suppose, is, every year we talk about it, but every year, it's the same scenario, right? How it works is unions are invited to put in their own submissions, and of course they ask for a massive increase. Employer groups make their own submissions, and of course they ask for a tiny little increase. And then what happens every single year, I mean, it's not exciting. It's not like, you're watching the latest episodes of Game of Thrones. It's every single year, without doubt, the Fair Work Commission ends up somewhere around about the middle, and they say, we've compromised. We've compromised between the two extremes of employer groups. I mean, it really is sort of Groundhog Day each year. And, just as an aside, some of the people taking part today might be fascinated to learn, the Fair Work Commission actually broadcasts the decision live on a web stream. Now, I don't know about you. Riveting stuff. Like, I don't know about you. I didn't rush out to the store and buy some popcorn waiting to watch the streaming. But anyway, I'll break the news to you. Every single year from now on, for as long as we have the Fair Work Commission, that's how it's going to work. Submissions from both sides, a compromise in the middle. That's how we roll. So identifying the correct minimum rate of pay, as you've already discovered, is quite a complex process. And we've broken it down into 3 steps. I like steps.
I like them too.
Steps make sense, right? So the first step is we do have to identify the correct or the applicable industrial instrument. And as we've just discussed, we know that that instrument will either be an enterprise agreement or a modern award, or for people who are agreement or award free, it will then be the National Minimum Wage Order. Okay, so that's how we're going to find the correct instrument to start with. Secondly, we then need to, within that instrument, identify the employee's correct classification level. Because as you know, every modern award and every enterprise agreement has its own internal classification levels, depending on the work that the employee does. Now, we need to know what that classification level is because otherwise we can't identify the correct applicable minimum. And in addition to that, we then have to go to step 3, which is looking at any penalty rates, loadings, overtimes, and allowances that are also payable. Because again, if we use the example of a casual employee, most casual employees are entitled to receive a minimum 25% casual loading.
Yeah.
So even once you've found the correct award, if it is an award, and then you found the employee's correct classification level, you then need to add on top of that the applicable casual loading. So it's only after we've gone through all 3 of those steps that we will have identified the employee's correct rate of pay. This is why it is such a complex issue, because if you get any of those 3 steps wrong, of course you're going to end up with the wrong rate.
And it's a minefield.
It is a complete minefield, and you know the best example I can give you of that minefield is there is currently an investigation going on to some underpayment in particular industries, and one of the things that's come to light as a result of that investigation is that a whole bunch of employers thought they were complying with the correct instrument. They thought they'd found the correct modern award. It actually turns out that they were using the wrong modern award.
Oh, no.
Now, even though they were fully compliant with the award they were using, doesn't matter because that award never applied to them. And remember, awards apply as a matter of law and not choice. So the correct instrument has completely different pay rates, and therefore they've been underpaying their staff.
Oh.
So you can see, even if you try and do the right thing, it's important that you do get good advice.
Absolutely, yep.
All right, now let's go back to step 1, because we'll go through each of those steps one by one. So step 1, identifying the correct instrument. Now, as we've discussed, 3 key instruments that you need to know about. So the first question I would always be asking is there a modern award or enterprise agreement that applies to employees in that business? Now we know, because we've just discussed it, and also we covered this in an earlier webinar this year, modern awards apply as a matter of law and not choice. So you can't pick and choose modern awards. You can't decide that you're just going to ignore the modern award because you don't particularly like it. If it applies, it applies.
Yep.
Okay. Now, some businesses have an enterprise agreement that they've negotiated. If they have done that, the enterprise agreement will then supersede the underpinning modern award.
Okay.
So one of the key reasons people negotiate enterprise agreements is to remove themselves from the award and all of its associated terms and conditions, and to bring people under usually a more simplified enterprise agreement.
And just to be clear, we are enterprise agreement as opposed to a contract of employment is quite different.
2 completely different things.
So, and I think some people get that confused.
Absolutely,
as well.
And it's not surprising, right? So, and actually that brings us to that final dot point on the slide here. Instruments, things like enterprise agreements and modern awards, they override employment contracts. And the simple reason for that is that an employment contract is simply a common law agreement made between 2 parties, the employer and the employee. Now, you can put whatever you like into your employment contract, but the problem is, if there is a statutory instrument that also applies, and for every employee in Australia, other than those exceptions in WA we talked about, there is the Fair Work Act to start with, which imposes a whole raft of minimum terms and conditions. And then there are things like modern awards, which impose additional terms and conditions, including minimum wages. So you can put whatever you like in a contract, but the statutory instruments will override whatever you put in that contract. Okay? So yeah, really important point you've just made about that distinction between a written agreement between the parties, which is common law, versus an enterprise agreement, which is a registered statutory instrument lodged and approved by the Fair Work Commission.
Just see that a bit, so
yeah.
I thought I'd better mention that.
Yeah, the other thing we see sometimes too is people who think that they're covered by an enterprise agreement, but then they discover to their horror that no one ever lodged the agreement for approval with the relevant authority. So they've been complying with that document, but it never took legal effect. And in those circumstances, it means that the award still applies. So again, you'll have another potential issue with payments there. All right? So first of all, you've got to find the correct instrument, as we saw. Now, step 2, once you've got the correct instrument, we do have to find the correct classification level for the employee. Now, if the employee is covered by a modern award, the award will contain rates of pay in the main body of the award usually. So there'll be a section which will usually be entitled minimum rates of pay, and you'll see, for example, in the General Retail Industry Award, employee classifications are called General Retail Employee Level 1, Retail Employee Level 2, etc. And there's a corresponding minimum rate of pay for those people. There's also then, in that same award, different rates of pay for junior staff, and of course then we also have the casual loading that applies too. Okay? Now, it's worth noting that in most modern awards, the pay rates are found in the body of the award, but the definitions for each of those classification levels, so the guidance that tells you whether someone is a level 2 or a level 3 employee, that's found in the schedule. So it's an attachment at the back of the modern award. Now, an enterprise agreement, a little bit different. In an enterprise agreement, the main classifications and the definitions, so the classification definitions as well as the pay rates, are usually found all together in the main body of the agreement. But there are some, you can draft an enterprise agreement really however you like, so some of them are formatted differently, but they will contain classification levels, and it's the same process as you're using within a modern award. Now, if someone's not covered by either a modern award or an enterprise agreement, so they're award and agreement free, then the national minimum wage becomes relevant, because that is effectively the safety net.
Yep.
If there's no minimum wage guaranteed for you in one of those other statutory instruments, the national minimum wage kicks in and it acts as your basic safety net.
Yep.
Now, the national minimum wage contains no classification levels. It's just one flat classification, if you like, but there is a distinction made for junior staff, and there's also that compulsory 25% casual loading.
Yeah.
Okay? But remember, the national minimum wage only applies if you are award and agreement free. Now, step 3, we have to add in any of these penalties, loadings, overtimes, and allowances. Now, just to break down what these things actually mean, because each of them has their own definitional meaning, if you like. So a penalty rate is an extra amount that we pay to someone to compensate them for working what is colloquially called unsociable hours. So working on a weekend, working very late at night, etc. Now, again, which penalty rates apply will be determined by an award or an enterprise agreement. There are no penalty rates within the national minimum wage itself. Okay, they only come from awards and agreements. Loadings, in contrast, are extra amounts paid just to casuals to compensate them for their lack of paid leave and also for their lack of receiving notice if they are dismissed.
Yes.
So to compensate them for that, they receive a 25%, in most cases, casual loading. Now, overtime is different from penalties. Overtime is the extra amount that we pay to people when they work over and above their guaranteed minimum hours, for example, for a part-time employee in most modern awards and agreements, or when we ask someone to work reasonable additional hours. So we might get them to work 40 hours in a week instead of the maximum 38 ordinary hours. That's when overtime rates kick in. Again, overtime only comes from awards and agreements, enterprise agreements. And then we have allowances. These are the extra amounts that we pay in certain circumstances, things like travel allowance, uniform allowance, tool allowance, etc. I mean, there are literally thousands and thousands of different allowances within the Fair Work system because they, again, only come from awards and enterprise agreements.
Yeah, and that'd be industry specific a lot of the time, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, yeah. So generally very industry specific.
Yeah.
All right. So remember that whether or not these amounts are payable will depend on which instrument covers the employee. So that's why it is absolutely critical as a first step, and that's why we call it step 1. we like being nice and clear here. The reason that we put that as step 1 is because you must identify the correct instrument first. So if the person's covered by a modern award or an enterprise agreement, all additional monetary entitlements will be detailed in that instrument itself. If the person is instead covered by the national minimum wage, as I mentioned before, there are no penalty rates, no allowances, and there are no overtime rates either. Okay? All right, so now that we know that, we've got those 3 steps. We know where to go to find the correct instrument, how to find the right rate of pay, and then add on the additional amounts.
Yeah.
Let's talk about this order that's handed down every year by the Fair Work Commission. Well, as I said slightly sarcastically earlier on, every single year it is basically the same process that's gone through. Everyone makes their submissions and then they end up somewhere in the middle. So the Fair Work Commission has just handed down its national minimum wage decision for 2016. So it comes through as what's called an order from the Fair Work Commission. And what they've decided to do is to increase the national minimum wage by 2.4%. And that equates to an increase of $15.80 per week on the national minimum wage. So from 1 July, the new national minimum wage will be $672.70 per week, or $17.70 per hour. Now, of course, that's for a full-time employee, and that's based on a 38-hour maximum ordinary working week.
Yeah.
All right, so that's the order that's just been handed down. Now, people might be thinking, oh, well, I'm not worried about the national minimum wage order because I pay my employees under a modern award because I've identified that as the applicable industrial instrument. Well, what every employer needs is that the national minimum wage increase flows through to all of those minimum rates in modern awards. So at the same time as the national minimum wage goes up by 2.4%, all of the modern award rates of pay will also rise by 2.4%. So all of Australia's modern awards will be updated between now and 1 July with the new rates. Now, a lot of people as soon as this minimum wage decision comes through, they start contacting the Workforce Guardian from ADP Workplace Advice Line, right? And they start contacting us to say, oh, can you please tell me what the new rates will be as of 1 July? Well, we can't actually tell you the correct rates because the Fair Work Commission does its own rounding. So it's not until the new awards are published by order, again, it has to be done by order, it's not until they are published by the Fair Work Commission that we can confirm to the correct cent what the new minimum rates will be. But all awards will be updated between now and 1 July. So then you'll know, closer to 1 July, what all of that rounding looks like as the new award comes out. All right? Now, for award and agreement-free employees, that is those people who do genuinely just receive or are entitled to receive the national minimum wage, I do want to emphasise again that the casual loading of 25% applies. And also, we also get asked, well, my employee is covered by the national minimum wage because there's no award or agreement, but they're only 16. So do we have to pay them the full national minimum wage? And the answer is no. And the reason for that is because junior employees receive the same adult equivalent percentage rates as you find in the Miscellaneous Award 2010.
Oh, there you go. I never knew that.
Right. So, and I know for anyone who's now completely confused, I don't blame you. So let's just clarify this a little bit more. There is one of the modern awards called the Miscellaneous Award 2010. The Miscellaneous Award contains junior rates of pay, and it shows them as a equivalent percentage of the full-time adult rate. So if you're 16, you get this percent of the adult rate, 17, etc. So you take those same percentages for the age of your employee, and you then apply those same percentages to the national minimum wage. So if someone's not covered by an award or an enterprise agreement, and they're under the full adult rate, which is usually 21 years of age, you would apply the same percentages to that minimum wage as are found in the Miscellaneous Award.
That's a quirky little system.
It is, and I just want to make sure that no one then goes and starts using all the other things in the Miscellaneous Award. The Miscellaneous Award might apply to your staff, but it's very unlikely. In this case, we're just talking about taking those percentage rates from it. Okay? So that's how that would work in relation to the national minimum wage order. All right, so let's look at these 3 most commonly asked questions that we receive about the minimum wage. So the first thing that we get asked is, well, I already pay rates that are more than 2.4% above the current minimum rate. So the rates I'm paying are already higher than what the new minimum rates are going to be from the 1st of July. Do I still need to worry about passing on an increase to my employees? The answer, good news, no. You don't need to pass on any increase if you're already paying above the national minimum wage plus the newly adjusted 2.4% increase. Effectively, it's called absorption. You can simply absorb that minimum legal increase into the already existing over-award amount.
Makes sense.
It does. And the only area, I suppose, where employers go wrong is they do that 1 year, and then the next year they just go, oh yeah, we ignored it last year, so we'll ignore it again this year. But of course, eventually, the national minimum wage might catch up to your above award rate. So you do just need to do the calculations every year, but that's how it works in practice. Okay?
Excellent.
All right, number 2 is I pay my employees a salary instead of paying them a wage. So does the national minimum wage order even apply to me? Well, the answer, and it will be a surprise to some of the people taking part today, is that absolutely yes, it does. Because it's all very well and good for you to pay a salary, but the Fair Work Act doesn't say anywhere that once you pay someone a salary that the rest of the Fair Work system doesn't apply. Okay? So if you are paying a salary, that's perfectly fine, but you still need to make sure that the amount you're paying is at least equal to or more than the amount the employee will be entitled to receive under their applicable instrument. Okay? So you do need to always do that calculation regularly. Whatever you're paying them cannot be less than whatever the underpinning minimum wage is.
So can I wear my tax hat for 1 second?
You can.
The national minimum wage, is that the inclusive or exclusive of superannuation figure?
Always exclusive.
Right, okay. So then it's the 9.5 compulsory superannuation over the top of that pay rate.
Correct. Absolutely right.
Just for clarity.
No, absolutely. So the Fair Work Commission and the Fair Work Ombudsman, for that matter, the other government agency, they will really only ever deal in figures that are pre-super, so pre-compulsory super contribution. So I suppose for employers, one of the mistakes they make is if they're doing a forward budget and they factor in what the salaries or wages will be for their staff, they forget to add in that 9.5%.
Yeah.
And as you
And that's
know,
what I was thinking as well, yeah.
And as you well know, it's not optional.
No.
You have to pay it, and effectively it is a 9.5% surcharge over and above what you're already paying your staff.
Yeah. And some awards and agreements actually do ask for greater amounts of super than the standard SG.
Yeah, they do.
Anyway.
Yeah, certainly enterprise agreements quite often have a much higher super contribution rate. Absolutely. Okay, so the next question is, well, when does this all take effect? It's all very well and good. Now that I know about this minimum wage, you keep talking about 1 July, is that when it kicks off? Well, it does and it doesn't. There's a little quirk. So the Fair Work Act recognises that every business in Australia has its own pay period. Some people pay weekly, monthly, fortnightly, whatever it is. So the new minimum wage kicks in the first full pay period in your business from the 1st of July onwards.
Okay.
So if you have a pay period that overlaps the 1st of July, let's just say hypothetically your pay period ends on the 3rd of July, it means you don't need to apply the new minimum wage until the beginning of the next pay period of July. Right?
Okay.
It saves you doing that pro rata calculation for halfway through a pay period. So amazing as it sounds, that's a rather helpful thing that the Fair Work Commission has done. Who knew?
I was going to say this is all very logical so far.
Well, yeah, it is.
Brilliant.
Well, it's all very logical, apart from the whole process that we go through about getting to this minimum wage.
Correct.
It does seem a bit of a farce every year, but anyway, it is what it is. All right. Now, we've actually got another FAQ that we added in earlier on today, which is about penalty rates, because we actually do get asked about penalty rates all the time. Many people taking part in today's webinar might know that currently there is a review being undertaken by the Fair Work Commission into penalty rates.
Yeah.
Now, there's a lot of misinformation out there about this penalty rates review, so let me just be very clear. The Fair Work Commission is not proposing to abolish, slash, tear away, destroy, any of those dramatic terms. It's not planning to do that in relation to penalty rates. All the Fair Work Commission is considering is whether or not the penalty rates in a very small number of modern awards, only in a very small number of them, in relation only to Sunday penalty rates, should be brought into line and make them the same as Saturday penalty rates. So the sky is not falling down.
Yeah.
Very minor adjustment. That's all they're looking at. But I just want to be clear that that review of penalty rates is completely separate from the national minimum wage decision.
You mean to tell me the media's blown this all out of proportion?
Amazing as it may seem, yes. Because especially, it doesn't help we're in the middle of a federal election campaign.
Yeah.
Both sides are sort of throwing this around the place all the time. But if we just drill down to the facts, this is a relatively minor change to penalty rates, and it has nothing to do with this national minimum wage decision. Now, the Fair Work Commission's decision about what will happen to Sunday penalty rates for people covered by that tiny number of modern awards, that decision will be handed down sometime in July after the election, and again, completely unrelated to the current process. So that is the national minimum wage in a nutshell, and you know what I can guarantee? Not many things I can guarantee in life, like death and taxes, right? But I guarantee you in 12 months, we will be running another of these webinars where we will be talking about next year's minimum wage decision, and it will be somewhere around halfway between what unions and employers wanted, and we'll go through this information again, because that is just the way our system works.
Yeah.
I don't see it changing anytime soon, but hopefully by answering those, certainly those most commonly asked questions, people taking part today now have a much clearer idea about what they do and do not have to do in relation to the adjustment.
Well, I think I've learned something today too, David.
Excellent.
It's been brilliant. So for all of you that have joined us today, I really hope you've got some really insightful information from David. Good news is, if you are a client of ADP, you are the lucky ones. You have the ability to call David and his team on the ADP advice line, 1300 443 088, and they can give you some advice over the phone if you need a bit of help with any of this.
Absolutely, and just if I can just again emphasise that it's probably not worth calling to get new rates of pay at this point because the awards haven't been published yet, but our staff on the ADP advice line, which is run by Workforce Guardians or ADP, we are very much looking forward to taking your calls closer to 1 July when all of those rates have been published.
Definitely, definitely. I guess at this stage more so if you're just confused about which award or which agreement applies, might be a good time to call.
Yeah, you won't be alone, that's for sure. Yeah.
And for any of you that have joined us today and you're not currently clients or interested about finding out more about how we can help you, our partnership can help you manage your business, please call the number on the screen, 1800 000 729. Thank you everyone for joining us. As I said, there will be a follow-up email with a recording to the webinar, and we will endeavour to address any questions that have come through during the session. Thank you very much, David.
My pleasure, Angela. Thanks for having me along.
Oh, it's been great. And hopefully we'll all tune in next time. Thank you.
See you later, everyone.